Hello and welcome to National Invasive Species Awareness Week, powered by the North American Invasive Species Management Association. My name is Elizabeth Brown, and I am your Legislative Affairs, Professional Development, and Certified Weed-Free Products Program Manager here at NAISMA. I am delighted to have you with us for the first webinar in the 2021 NISAW series titled Invasive Species Priorities and Opportunities for the Biden-Harris Administration and members of the 117th Congress. NISAW is an international event to raise awareness about invasive species, the threat they pose, and what can be done to prevent their spread. Representatives from local, state, federal, and regional organizations normally gather to discuss policies, legislation, and improvements that can be done to improve invasive species prevention and management. Unfortunately, we are not able to be together in DC this year, but nevertheless, we have an outstanding lineup for you of virtual webinars every day this week. We also have a downloadable turnkey resource toolkit available at NISAW.org for your use. Now let's get right to the main event. We have 3 expert panelists for you today. Our first presentation is titled An Overview of the North American Invasive Species Management Association and will be presented by Belle Bergner, Executive Director. Following Belle, our second presentation is titled Invasive Species Opportunities in the 117th Congress and the first year of the Biden administration. That presentation will be given by Scott Cameron, former Acting Assistant Secretary of the Interior for Policy, Management, and Budget. The third and final presentation will be titled The National Environmental Coalition on Invasive Species and Their Recommendations to the Biden-Harris Administration and members of the 117th Congress. And that will be presented by Caroline Murphy, Government Relations Manager for the Wildlife Society and Coordinator for NISAS. Be sure to put your questions in the Q&A box today and specifically identify for us who your question is for. We will hold all questions until after the presentations. So again, put your questions in the Q&A box and not the chat so we don't lose them, and we'll be sure to get to your questions after the presentations. And with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker, NAISMA's Executive Director, Belle Bergner. Belle has been NAISMA's Executive Director since 2016. Since joining NAISMA, she has grown the organization's budget tenfold and facilitated the national and international growth of NAISMA's programs, membership, and partnerships. With over 18 years of experience in environmental nonprofit management, Belle is a creative problem solver who enjoys connecting ideas and gathering people to solve environmental challenges. Prior to leading NAISMA, Belle coordinated the Upper Midwest Invasive Species Conference for 8 years, did freelance grant writing for environmental organizations, and was an Outward Bound instructor in Maine. Belle has a Master's of Ecology and Evolution from the University of Pennsylvania and a Bachelor's in Biology from Mount Holyoke College. In her free time, Belle enjoys long walks and doing just about anything outside with her family in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Thank you for being here, Belle.
Well, again, thanks, Elizabeth, for that really nice introduction. And thank you all for being here with us today for the start of National Invasive Species Awareness Week. I am personally really excited to learn from such a great webinar lineup this week. And Elizabeth, as Elizabeth said, we unfortunately, while we can't be together in person, we can do so much virtually, and this is just one of those opportunities. So again, I'm the Executive Director of NAISMA, and I'm going to start by telling you a bit about who we are. But first, I want to make sure we're all on the same page here. I know we have such a diverse audience. Let's make sure we all know what we're talking about. What's the problem? Okay, so I'm going to pose that the problem is really 2-part that NAISMA aims to work on. And the first is the biological issue. The biological problem is that we're dealing with invasive species, which is invasive species are organisms, including those seeds, eggs, or other biological material capable of propagating itself that does or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health where it is not native. Okay, that's kind of a combination of a few different definitions, but that's the gist. So basically we're dealing with organisms that evolved over millions of years somewhere else and managed to get somewhere where it did not evolve and in a new ecosystem that's not ready for it. The second part of the problem is how it got to its new environment. The issue is human activity. Humans have gotten really good at traveling anywhere and everywhere in the globe. So because of our activities, we are the ones creating and fueling those pathways of invasive species spread. Okay, so they basically, invasive species, I'm going to show a few pictures here. If we had time, we'd look at 1,000 pictures that demonstrate the problem, but you'll hear through the webinars this week some very detailed explanations of the invasive species problem. I just want to touch on a few here in case you can't get to all the webinars this week. Okay, so let's start with over here, wildfire. We now know that invasive grasses, some invasive grasses, and standing dead trees that are dead because of an invasive forest pest, such as pine bark beetle, fuel wildfires. We had a devastating wildfire season this past year, 2020, and it was in part of the severity of the fires was due to invasive grasses like cheatgrass and the damage caused by those pine bark beetles and other forest pests. Okay, let's just walk down here counterclockwise. This is the Asian longhorn beetle. If you live in South Carolina or anywhere near there, that is where the most recent population was found. As its name implies, it came from Asia, was transported here possibly through packaging material or pallets, and so it's devastating to forests. You can get a sense of its size there. It's been found in other areas in the eastern US. Again, moving counterclockwise, these are feral hogs. They are now an issue from Canada down to Mexico. They eat everything and create impressive damage in their wake. But there have been some really good success stories of being able to eradicate them and prevent them in many places. Over here, we've got Eurasian water milfoil. When it gets into a waterway, if it's not eradicated quickly, it can very quickly take over freshwater bodies, ruining fisheries and aquatic life. I'm going to stick over in the aquatic side. These are quagga and zebra mussels. They came over here in the ballast water of shipping tankers and have created very big problems in the Great Lakes and have migrated through recreational vehicles, boats, kayaks, canoes, into other water bodies. But there are some great programs now set up to detect and prevent these from getting into waterways, and you'll learn about those again later this week. And finally, this is a mosquito. The West Nile virus is going to be an increasing problem with climate change. As climate change warms and increases the range of this species, it's going to become a problem in more geographic areas. So these are just pictures to kind of give a snapshot for those who are new to invasive species of what we're talking about. If you were to just look at a picture of this, you wouldn't know that they're a problem, but thanks to the efforts of invasive species prevention and detection programs and managers who are on the ground, which NISAW supports, and I'm going to talk about how we support them, we know that these are a problem and we know how to prevent them and manage them. Okay, so let me move on. So our mission at the North American Invasive Species Management Association is to support, promote, and empower invasive species prevention and management in North America to deal with those problems that I just showed you. In our 28th year now, we are governed by a 15-member board of directors and supported by 10 very active committees and a staff of 8 employees and contractors. So in summary, what I'm going to hope to paint a picture of is how we attempt to bridge the divide between what basically the invasive species concerns that aren't confined to jurisdictional boundaries. Invasive species spread across jurisdictional boundaries. Our programs aim to support the work that crosses those divides. And we also hope to be a convener and bridging the divides of other environmental concerns. Invasive species impact wildlife, water quality, so many other ecosystem health effects. And a part of what we do is try to connect those dots. So let's go on here. And while the organization started with Western land managers 28 years ago, we now have quite a diverse membership and subscriber list. So we're working with nonprofit organizations, local county agencies, state agencies, federal agencies, regional partnerships, you name it, you can read that list there. And we are no longer, while the organization was started focused on weeds, we now work to really be inclusive of all invasive species concerns, because a lot of the same messaging and techniques can transfer among all the different taxa. So here is a snapshot of just some of the range of types of organizations we work with. These are some of our local partners on the bottom, and national organizations, national nonprofits, and federal agencies. We have significant funding support from the Forest Service, USDA APHIS, and national memorandums of understanding with Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, and Park Service. And finally, internationally, we work with the Canadian Council on Invasive Species, and to the south with the Commission on Biodiversity and Knowledge. All right, and just a snapshot of kind of where our members are. You can see we do have membership ranging across the country, but absolutely we do not have everyone in our fold, and we're getting there. And I hope that by the end of this presentation, I've convinced you, if you are not a member or subscriber, to start to tune in and become a member and let us know how we can support you. So now we have over 400 members and partner organizations today. We have over 7,000 social media followers and email subscribers. And as I mentioned, a variety of MOUs with international, national, and state partnerships. Okay, so now I'm going to take you through a little bit about our programs that aims to bridge those divides and support the work of invasive species prevention and management. Our organization, our programs can basically be encapsulated into these in 4 main programs. I'm going to start first by talking about our standards, our weed-free product standards and certification, and then I'll talk about our prevention and outreach campaign called Play Clean Go, and then I'll talk about our advocacy work through National Invasive Species Awareness Week and other legislative activities, and finally professional development. All right, so first, the program that really first got our organization going was an effort of local land managers to get together and make sure that forage was being, a certified weed-free forage was being done in a uniform, consistent way, and that neighbors were looking for the same invasive species that were of locally. So, excuse the text messages. So right now, we started with Western states. We now have 30 MOUs in 26 states, over 300 inspectors certified across the US. And now federal agencies are participating, and a growing number of federal agencies are interested. We also now have a new mulch standard. So in addition to forage and gravel that was updated last year, we have a new mulch standard. So if you have forage, hay, gravel pits, or mulch being developed or produced in your area, you should look into our program and see if your state is not already a partner. Reach out and let's work together to help get this tool into your area's toolbox. It's basically a few very important pathways, and it's going to be a growing pathway for many areas of the country and continent. A quick snapshot of who our weed-free product partners are. In the green are where we have states with MOUs that cover the entire state, and the blue states are those where we have at least 1 or more counties as participating partners. Significant funding from USDA APHIS has really helped us to grow this program eastward, so we're very grateful for that support. And we've identified some barriers and some ideas on how to incorporate our program eastward to help integrate it a little bit more easily. Okay, moving on to Play Clean Go. This is our education and outreach campaign. It is a branded, patented campaign started at Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. It was designed to be a clear, consistent, and unified message used across geographic boundaries. And it was so successful in Minnesota that they needed a partner to help manage it outside the state. So we took over the campaign for the US. Canadian Council on Invasive Species manages the campaign in Canada, and it's just growing like really like weeds, if you'll pardon the pun. Again, the goal is that there's a consistent and unified message, and that this brand is placed at every trailhead, recreational access point, anywhere where recreationists are getting out and enjoying the outdoors. The idea is that, we're reminding recreationists that before you go play, clean your gear and then go. So while the program for recreationists has been really successful, we've developed a sub-brand for the worker community with the suggestion of our members and partners. They said, you know what, this is great. We use this outreach tool for our parks and our trailheads, but what we really need also is a message for our workers who are out there doing field work, because we recognize that tools and all the worker gear needs to be cleaned as well. That is a major pathway for invasive species. So the goals are, again, to get this brand and message across the country. We have turnkey outreach products. You, as a partner, you get discounts off of all of the outreach materials. These are trail signs. These are the newly designed trail signs. We now have Spanish translation, and this is our new kiosk educational display. You can choose your character. This is our new friend Steward, and you can choose from any of these panels and customize it with your local messaging. Here's an example of what our new sign is looking like out in the wild. Here's on the right is a boot brush station at the National Wildlife Refuge, Wapak National Wildlife Refuge in Massachusetts, I believe. And here on the right is in the Kissimmee Prairie Preserve of Florida. Here's a snapshot of our store. So again, click on the store at the top of our website and you can find prevention tools and outreach materials for your organization. We use digital media very heavily. One of the important things behind community-based social marketing, which the campaign is based on, is to reinforce the message as much as possible. We also design the social marketing and digital marketing to be kind of grab and go. So a lot of our partners actually take the posts and use them in their own channels to share the same consistent message. I want to highlight and make note, if anyone's not aware, we have an awareness week in June. It'll be June 5th to the 12th this year. We reach hundreds of thousands of individuals with the same message, and it's designed to work around National Trails Day and National Get Outdoors Day. And so yeah, take note of that. Follow us if you aren't already, and help spread that message to your recreationists. Okay, moving on to professional development. We have a certification training for invasive species management. We're going to be basically expanding on that over the coming year with support from USDA APHIS to develop an asynchronous learning library. It's going to be geographically specific and customizable. So depending on where you live and work, you will be able to choose the modules that make sense for you. So if you are in a state or a local area where you need to train folks on invasive species identification, management techniques, et cetera, we hope that this becomes really the national sort of go-to learning opportunity and training opportunity for folks. Webinars, we have a free monthly webinar series. This NISAW week right here is something special. It's additional, and while it is free, we also offer the opportunity for continuing education credits at our monthly webinar series for those who need those continuing education credits. And our annual conference, I'll wrap up with that. And this past year, we were virtual, but did have still great attendance. We had over 350 attendees ranging all over North America. And this coming year, we'll be in Montana at the end of September in Missoula. This will be co-hosted with the Montana Invasive Species Council. Call for abstracts opens this week. Stay tuned for that. And in the future, we plan to be in 2022 in Florida, and in 2023, we'll be in Nebraska. And here's just a quick shot from our 2019 conference in New York. The picture on the left is actually, this is a welcome keynote, and that's at the very front of the room. Sorry, the picture is not great, but that's Elise Stefanik, representative who's a co-chair of the Invasive Species Caucus. She gave the welcome remarks at our event. So we look forward to working with the Invasive Species Caucus this year and in coming years to identify resources and improve legislation for invasive species. Finally, advocacy, as you all know, this is National Invasive Species Awareness Week, and we're really working hard to collaborate with other organizations working on invasive species advocacy. As you'll hear from our speakers today, we want to make it more accessible to you all and to our members, to facilitate member communication with elected officials when appropriate, and develop an advocacy strategy on invasive species. So we've published position papers in the past. We probably will do more in the future as it becomes relevant and necessary. And I just want to point out that later this year in May, we'll have a NISAW week focused on education and outreach. If you hold local events, we want to encourage you to publish your local events on our web map. That will be released probably in the next few weeks, maybe a month. So we want to encourage, we want to promote your events. We want to help educate elected officials and other folks in your area about opportunities to learn about what you all are doing and how to get involved. And again, our outreach toolkit will be updated along with social media graphics. And I'll wrap up with membership benefits. We have a growing number of benefits, including a First Friday networking opportunity, our growing webinar library. All webinars are recorded, and then the recordings are accessible only to members. Here's an example of one of them. Biocontrol agents that was discussed last August with Joey Milan and John Kaltenbach. It was a great webinar. And there's just a shot of our Zoom-based virtual networking webinars. First Fridays that are happening once a month at the first Friday. And with that, I hope I've encouraged you to join us on our journey. If you're not a member, we hope you will join us and let us know how we can partner and support you. So with that, we really do look forward to partnering and supporting you. Let us know if you don't see a resource that you need and that your staff needs. Let us know. We really do want to be the go-to resource for invasive species management and prevention in North America. So with that, I will turn it over back to Elizabeth and the next speaker.
Okay, thank you so very much, Belle. That was outstanding. And I have been just reminding folks to put your questions in the Q&A for us, and we'll get to those questions after the event. So let's move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Scott Cameron, former Acting Assistant Secretary of the Interior for Policy Management and Budget. Scott is an experienced executive who has repeatedly demonstrated success in natural resources, agriculture, energy, and environmental policy. He has a uniquely broad government perspective, having worked as both a career civil servant and a political appointee in federal government. He's also served as a staff to the Governor of California, as a congressional staffer, and as an elected local official. In addition, he has engaged on these policies as a corporate executive, as part of a trade association, through industry coalitions, and as a management consultant to federal agencies and in the nonprofit sector. Scott recently left federal government, where he had served as Acting Assistant Secretary for Policy Management and Budget at the U.S. Department of the Interior. In that capacity, he oversaw department-wide budget, invasive species, natural resource damage assessment and restoration, environmental compliance, and numerous administrative functions of this $14 billion agency with 65,000 employees. Scott directly oversaw a staff of 2,800 individuals and a budget of $350 million. In 2014, Scott founded the Reduce Risks of Invasive Species Coalition to educate decision makers in Washington, D.C. on the ecological, economic, and public health impacts of invasive species. In 2015, he was elected director of the Northern Virginia Soil and Water Conservation District after a successful campaign during which he received the endorsements of both the Sierra Club and the Tea Party. Earlier in his career, Scott worked at the White House Office of Management and Budget, where he oversaw the budget, regulatory activity, and legislation involving large parts of EPA and the Interior Department. In the private sector, he set up the government relations function of a multinational corporation. Scott is a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration and has a long-standing relationship with the Partnership for Public Service. He earned an MBA from Cornell University and a BA in biology from Dartmouth College. Scott is married, has a grown son, and 2 rescue cats. Scott is a NAISMA member and very active in our legislative committee, and we are incredibly grateful that he's here with us today. Go ahead, Scott, take it away.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth, very much for that really gracious introduction there. I think probably my most important credential is the fact I'm a NAISMA member. So, and everyone else out there, send in your check, sign up. So with that, I'm planning on doing today is chatting with you all a bit about some of the priorities that I would suggest the new Biden-Harris administration might look at as we move ahead in the first year of the administration and the very beginning of the 117th Congress. So here we go. Here's an outline of what I'll be talking about. My talk will be organized in 2 different ways, looking at near-term opportunities, things that could happen in the next 6 months, and longer-term opportunities, 6 to 19 months. 19 months is basically the time frame of what's left in this Congress before it's likely to adjourn before the November 22 elections. And within each of those timeframes, I look at administrative budgetary and legislative initiatives and ideas. So jumping right into it, near-term opportunities in the administrative arena. Near the end of the previous administration, the Interior Department submitted around 700 pages of documentation on a wide variety of activities that have been shown across of our bureaus for many years to control invasive species without harming the environment. We were asking the Council on Environmental Quality to approve those activities under what's called a categorical exclusion from the National Environmental Policy Act. Due to time pressure and competing priorities, CEQ did not act that massive amount of documentation. I would hope that the new Interior Department leadership and the new leadership of CEQ would turn its attention to getting those categorical exclusions across the finish line so Interior's bureaus can respond faster and more cost effectively to invasive species occurrences. The second area I'm suggesting administrative action take place on is the need for the U.S. Geological Survey to get a better scientific understanding of zoonotic diseases like COVID-19, like West Nile virus, like Zika, and several others that could come to mind rather quickly. The current Secretary of the Interior has available to her, once she's confirmed, about $90 million of money that Congress already appropriated in conjunction with the CARES Act. COVID-19 being a zoonotic disease, I think it's entirely appropriate that some of that money be spent by giving it to the U.S. Geological Survey to better understand zoonotic diseases. Finally, I'd suggest that the administration reconstitute the Invasive Species Advisory Committee, which is a FACA committee that had been in effect for a number of years but has lapsed, and that the FACA committee, ISAC, newly reconstituted, focus on recommending research priorities to the federal government. Fourthly, the Interior Department ought to join an existing memorandum agreement between the Western Governors Association and the Forest Service on landscape management. Similarly, USC, NRCS, and NIMS ought to sign onto an existing interagency agreement for rapid response to invasive mussels. Looking at near-term opportunities in the budget arena, in the month of March and month of April will be key windows for this administration to submit its budget request to the Congress. I'm suggesting that the new administration support what the Congress just did in FY21 and fund the National Invasive Species Council at $1.2 million, that it fully fund the reauthorized Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which in memory serves me is at $375 million. Some of that money goes into invasives, and that the huge bump up in Asian carp funding in 21 be maintained in the president's 22 budget. So, similarly, to improve implementation of that interagency memorandum of agreement on invasive mussels, I'm suggesting there ought to be increases across the federal agencies to improve boat inspection decontamination. Both the Bureau of Reclamation and the Fish and Wildlife Service had some really interesting and I think useful experiences with Genius prizes, research prizes for invasives. So I suggest those continue. Looking ahead a little bit further, this summer will be time to actually work on the FY23 budget. Budgets are an 18-month cycle, so you actually need to be thinking at least 18 months ahead. In addition to maintaining the current initiatives, there's a lot of opportunity for increased work in terms of rangeland weeds at BLM and the Forest Service. There's opportunity for biocontrol research. eDNA, I think, is really promising, and USGS ought to continue funding in that area. For those of us in the Pacific Northwest, the newly created Giant Hornet program in the Fish and Wildlife Service merits some attention from the budget standpoint. One of the things that became clear during the Department of Interior's public comment period on the new strategic plan was how significant feral hogs are across the country. Agriculture, USDA typically has a lead on feral hogs. I think Interior needs to up its game. And while the administration proposed to fund and the Congress supported an Alaska EDRR pilot, I'd suggest that a second one ought to be initiated in the state of Hawaii. Alaska and Hawaii are very different places in terms of their institutional development on early detection and rapid response. A second pilot would be really good. Looking at legislative opportunities, there's been a lot of interest for quite a few years on how to fund early detection and rapid response. There have been a few false starts. I'm suggesting that Congress take a look at the issue and figure out practical ways through legislative hearings to make EDRR work and have the federal agencies, federal government contribute to it. Farm Bill, a huge amount of money is associated with every 5-year Farm Bill. Looking at the 2023 Farm Bill has got to be a focus area. I'm hoping that everyone on this presentation today will take advantage of, as Belle mentioned, NISAW 2021 to lobby Congress on these issues. It's important to note, as Belle alluded to, that there's a climate change aspect for invasives. There's clearly an infrastructure aspect to invasives, and there's a significant connection with wildland fire. There'll be wildland fire legislation reintroduced. Invasives need to be a featured element of that. Looking at long-term opportunities now, the Lacey Act needs to be overhauled. The legislative process for listing the regulatory process for listing injurious species just takes way too long. We've got to figure out how to make that faster. We need to build on what the previous administration started in terms of looking for opportunities to coordinate activities between the national invasive species and the intergovernmental, really, Wildland Fire Leadership Council. Both communities kill vegetation and deal with vegetation. There need to be ways that they can coordinate more closely. Hopefully, once the Council on Environmental Quality approves a new NEPA categorical exclusions, DOI bureaus need to be encouraged to take full advantage of that. Looking at the FY24 process, which is only about 13 or 14 months out, need to build on the previous successes. Whatever improvements we're able to make to the operation of the Lacey Act, need to spend whatever money is necessary to make that program more successful and expedite the regulatory activity. And hopefully we will have learned how we can have better coordination between the wildland fire community and the invasive plant community and make some investments to fund that. From a legislative standpoint, longer term, the Bureau of Reclamation, a lot like the Army Corps of Engineers, tends to operate on specific statutory authorities. So while the Corps of Engineers has specific statutory authorities for controlling invasive mussels, Reclamation doesn't. We ought to look at the Water Resources Development Act in 2022 and give BOR some explicit authority. Assuming that the congressional oversight activities in the near term come up with some recommendations on EDRR, we ought to be looking for the Congress to provide whatever additional statutory authority might be necessary to implement those authorities. I'm guessing a state grant program in the Fish and Wildlife Service might be one of those ideas that emerges from those oversight hearings. The Lacey Act has been hobbled as a result of a court decision on the Association of Reptile Keepers, where the court decided that the Fish and Wildlife Service has been inappropriately trying to control interstate as opposed to international commerce for quite a few decades. I think it's time for the Congress to deal with the defect in the law that the courts identified and to make it explicit in the statute that interstate commerce, as opposed to simply international commerce, is supposed to be regulated under the Lacey Act. Finally, there are plenty of opportunities, I think, for improved coordination on aquatic nuisance species across the federal government, and new statutory authority could do that. As I'm wrapping up here, I think it's really important as we focus on advocacy that we focus on communicating to the right people at the right time and give them actionable requests. Simply saying spend more money on invasives isn't very helpful. On the other hand, if we can identify specific places in an agency's budget structure and make specific recommendations for changes, that's something the Congress can act on. We need, as Belle suggested, to work more closely with the Congressional Invasive Species Caucus. We need to recognize that all politics is local. Members of Congress are very concerned about what's going on in their city, in their county, in their state. They're less concerned about what's happening 3 states or 4,000 miles away. So we need to leverage the local focus of legislators, the statewide focus of legislators, and make the invasive species topic relevant to them. Finally, the invasive species topic is a wonderful opportunity to work both sides of the aisle. An Emerald Ash Borer doesn't care whether that big tree in front of someone's house is owned by a Democrat or Republican, a progressive or a Tea Party member. It's just going to kill the tree. So this is a great opportunity for us to make friends across the aisle and give people from all the ideological perspectives in Congress something to work on together. So with that, I will stop. Thank you very much. Take it away, Elizabeth.
Okay, thank you so much, Scott. That was outstanding. All right, we will hold questions for Scott until after the next presentations. But again, just go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A and we will get to them. All right, our next speaker I'm delighted to introduce is Caroline Murphy, Government Relations Manager for the Wildlife Society and Coordinator for the National Environmental Coalition on Invasive Species. Caroline is a professional association dedicated to inspiring, empowering, and enabling wildlife professionals to sustain wildlife populations and habitats through science-based management and conservation at the Wildlife Society. Caroline implements the Society's legislative and regulatory policy priorities at the federal level and coordinates with regionally based chapters and sections on their implementation of policy correspondence. Caroline also serves as coordinator for NISAW, as I already mentioned, and NISAW is a coalition of environmental organizations and professionals, societies focused on promoting scientifically sound policies that prevent the introduction and spread of invasive species in the United States. I am really delighted to have met Caroline recently and to be engaging with NISAW, and so I'm so happy that she is able to be here today and participate in our webinar. So go ahead and share your screen and you can take it away.
All right, thanks so much, Elizabeth. As Elizabeth stated, my name is Caroline Murphy. I'm the Government Relations Manager at the Wildlife Society. I also do interact as coordinator with the National Environmental Coalition on Invasive Species. So the National Environmental Coalition on Invasive Species, it was established in 2003. It's made up of 12 national environmental organizations and professional societies. While many of our organizations do interact in state, regional, local issues, the work that we all interact together on is targeted at federal level engagement. So as Elizabeth stated, our tagline is to focus on promoting scientifically sound policies that prevent the introduction and spread of invasive species into the United States. Our coalition is collaborative and voluntarily based, so all of our agendas are very much driven by the individual organizations that we engage with and what their interests are in moving forward. So you can check out, I'm going to be going through the recommendations that we provided to the new Congress and the new administration, but you can also check out previous policy correspondence from the coalition at nisaw.net. So this is a list of the organizations that interacted with the creation of these recommendations. So again, federal, national environmental NGOs, as well as professional societies is really where our niche is. Other partners that were not involved in the crafting of these recommendations but are members of NISAW can be found on our website. If you just go to nisaw.net/partners, you can get the full list of the 12 organizations that we interact with. Okay, so agency level recommendations. This is just a bit.ly link to the recommendations. If you do not already have them on hand through the webinar materials, I definitely recommend taking a look at them. I am going to be breezing through these recommendations today in order to get through 20 minutes allotted, but there is a lot more detail provided in those recommendations. So these are the 5 agencies that we looked at. Again, these are based on the interests of our organizations interacting with these documents. So obviously there are other federal agencies that interact in the invasive species space. There may also be other invasive species programming or associated programming within these agencies that we have identified that are not targeted within our recommendations. So just a heads up on that as you are looking through these recommendations and looking to have context alongside them. One other item I did want to mention, so we are largely targeting the invasive species space, but alongside that, as Scott previously discussed as well, there is interest from several of these organizations in wildlife zoonotic diseases and their interactions with invasive species management. This is particularly the case with diseases of unknown origin or known invasive pathogens or non-native pathogens. So just a heads up on that. As far as cross-cutting themes go for these recommendations, one of them, very obvious low-hanging fruit, need for increased funding at the federal level for invasive species prevention and management activities. The other one being federal and partner collaboration mechanisms. So not only how these federal agencies interact with each other, but also other federal entities, states, tribes, NGOs, etc. And then another one, a need for federal leadership. So especially over the past few years, there has very much been a reframing of working to empower states to do a lot of invasive species management and prevention activities. And we targeted some of those program areas that we think require reinvigoration and reinvestment at the federal level in order to allow for appropriate coordination on invasive species prevention work. Okay, so the first agency that we targeted, the U.S. Forest Service, here are a couple of programs of interest within the agency that we have stated recommendations for. So number one, the Forest Health Management Program that works to support partner efforts to prevent, monitor, suppress insects, diseases, other pests on both partner and private lands. And this is done through both technical assistance as well as financial assistance. Another one, the U.S. Forest Service Research and Development Program. So the Forest Service is the largest institution in the world largest research institution in the world on forestry related issues. So they study a diversity of natural resource challenges, not just invasive species, but we've really targeted those programs within these recommendations. Here are a couple of hurdles to success that we have identified within these 2 program areas. So again, a big one, inadequate funding, especially within the private lands component of forest health management. So things like native species, native pest management within forest health has very much been targeted for funding by the federal government, less so items on invasive species management in the private land setting. So that is one hurdle to success that we have identified of competing allocation of resources in the native versus non-native pest space. Another one with U.S. Forest Service Research and Development. So again, inadequate funding, as well as an overall lack of research support. So there has been a significant decrease in funding of non-native pest monitoring and research on the R&D side of things over the past 10 years. We've also seen things like a lack of political support for the wildlife and fisheries research and development programming, with associated attempts to remove those fundings within budgets and realignment of the U.S. Forest Service. Okay, so what have we identified as priorities for the U.S. Forest Service in moving them into this administration in this Congress and this Congress? So funding items that we have identified: forest health management, increased funding to private lands, specifically for non-native species monitoring and assistance. Forest health management targeting of invasive pests, so along those same lines. Within research and development, they typically receive about $300 million annually, the entire pot of funding for R&D. Only about 10% of that funding is currently targeted at non-native pests and pathogens. An even smaller portion of that is currently targeted at wildlife and fisheries research. So we recommend program-wide, R&D-wide, at least $315 million in the next fiscal year, in fiscal year 22, to start chipping away at some of those resource limitations. One other item, so on the federal leadership side of things, we recommended that the service work towards enhancement of natural pest resistance through the breeding of pest-resistant trees. This should be done in partnership with other federal, state, tribal, and academic partners to kind of really create and boost a long-term program for the U.S. Forest Service. So the next agency we targeted, the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, I'm going to be referring to it as APHIS from here on out. So that's what I mean when I say APHIS. The Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, they're responsible for preventing the introduction, mitigating the impacts of pests, disease, and plants that may be harmful to the United States natural resources, livestock interests, or other farming interests. I'm sorry if you hear my dog scratching himself. He is right next to me right now, and he has his collar on, so that's what you are hearing. For plant protection and quarantine, so that is one area that we have targeted for recommendations. This is a unit of APHIS that carries out the agency's legal responsibilities to mitigate impacts of plant pests, invasive plants, and noxious weeds. Another area we targeted, veterinary services within APHIS, so they house the captive cervid herd certification program. So this is a volunteer program that captive deer farmers, so cervids, deer, and captive deer farmers states can opt into in order to allow for the interstate movement of captive deer, elk, and moose species. So we'll get into the details on that in a second. But here are the hurdles to success that we've really identified for these two program areas. So with plant protection and quarantine, PPQ, they do presently have the authority to regulate known plant pests. What they presently lack, though, is the authority to address pathways, host species for pests, or commodities that really are occurring kind of in the absence of a specifically designated plant pest. And as a result, the agency does not have the tools to address many issues that result within modern trade practices. They've also been hampered by inadequate resources, as well as a broader reluctance to impose strict trade measures at points of entry. Within veterinary services, so the captive cervid herd certification program, existing regulation and guidelines for the program are inadequate to prevent the introduction and spread of chronic wasting disease, which is a deadly prion disease in deer species. So within the context of hurdles to success, it kind of has resulted in a state-by-state patchwork of some states opting into it, some captive cervid farmers wanting to interact with the program, and a kind of a real lack of federal leadership on that platform. Okay, so we provided a lot of recommendations within the APHIS space on what we would like to see done within this administration and Congress. I'm not going to have time to go through all of them, but on the funding side of things, we do recommend an increase in funding to plant protection and quarantine in order to allow for a more robust implementation of their programming. For the collaboration side of things, so we also request appropriations report language that looks at the feasibility and need for creation of any potential cooperative center that will allow for a multidisciplinary, multi-agency approach to dealing with pests at points of entry and post-entry. On the federal leadership side of things, so again, I'm not going to be able to go through all of these, but these recommendations do all look at ways to reduce risk, mitigate risk brought on by invasive species or invasive pathogens and pests, most notably at points of entry. This is both through modification of regulation as well as congressional oversight, calls for congressional oversight. On the captive cervid herd certification program standard, so that item within veterinary services, we also do request a reinvigoration of those guidelines to more proactively assist in the prevention of the spread of chronic wasting disease. Okay, so next agency, U.S. Geological Survey within the Department of the Interior. So we largely focused on the ecosystems mission area within these recommendations. So these program areas targeted here, they are cooperative science entities that work to get natural resource research of relevance to decision makers and stakeholders on the ground directly to them. So it is decision maker and stakeholder informed science. For the National Wildlife Health Center, that is currently a U.S. Geological Survey-wide program, but it is presently funded within the Ecosystems Mission Area of USGS. It allows for, it's the only national center that is targeted at wildlife disease detection, control, and prevention in the United States. So their work includes things like avian influenza work, chronic wasting disease work, white nose syndrome work, B-cell work. So they offer a breadth of input and research on wildlife and zoonotic diseases. Okay, so hurdles to success, again, big one, funding. So these 4 program areas within the ecosystems mission area all deal with inadequate funding and funding mechanisms in order to be responsive to the needs of stakeholders on the ground. The National Wildlife Health Center, so Scott did already discuss this a little bit, our recommendations largely focused on the infrastructure needs of the center. So presently the National Wildlife Health Center is in bad shape. The physical buildings are in bad shape and are in need of infrastructure improvements in order to continue their relevance within wildlife disease monitoring and research into the years to come. Another one, survey-wide, over the past few years, there have been several reports within the survey of efforts to impede the work of scientific professionals at the survey. So getting into the recommendations, this is really just kind of targeting the need for a new and improved scientific integrity policy. These recommendations were written prior to the Biden administration's recent actions on scientific integrity. The funding items, so these are all listed here. I won't get too much into those, but happy to answer any questions on those funding requests. On the ACE Act implementation, so Scott already mentioned we are looking at ways to fund directly National Wildlife Health Center funding. ACE Act, America's Conservation Enhancement Act, I apologize, I'm very bad with acronyms, would allow for one potential mechanism to explore that. Okay, so the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, that is our next agency that we targeted. Scott very much got into the Lacey Act implementation side of things. Our recommendations very much echo that, so I'm not going to get too much into that. On the National Wildlife Refuge System side of things, the National Wildlife Refuge System is targeted with implementing the management conservation needs of the National Wildlife Refuge System units across the United States, as well as associated national marine monuments and co-management of some national monuments. Okay, so for hurdles to success, just going over what Scott had previously said about the U.S. government's limited ability to regulate interstate transport of listed injurious species. There was also, over the past few years, a lack of support for the injurious species listing process. There were no new injurious species listings within the past 4 years. So that has been a major impediment to federal leadership within the invasive species space. Also, the actual just logging of live wildlife imports into the U.S. to allow for an understanding at the end user, the decision maker of, oh, these species are coming in, I need to have an understanding of their potential risks. That system, that coordination and collaboration system, there is a lot of room for improvement there. Within the National Wildlife Refuge System, there is a need for more on-the-ground management funding within the operations and management line item. They've been chronically underfunded for years. They're currently at about $500 million annually, which is the same funding level they were at in fiscal year 2010. So there is a large need for a reinvestment of on-the-ground natural resource management on refuge system lands. Okay, so the items that we've targeted for funding. So refuge system operations and maintenance, associated invasive species strike teams within the refuge system. So these strike teams, they operate in the early detection and rapid response line of invasive species prevention and management. And they both work within the refuge system and on partner lands to deal with invasive weeds, pests, etc. at the point of detection and identification. Collaboration, so creation of a standardized process for logging wildlife imports, is an important item for this administration to review and evaluate for feasibility and implementation. And then I'm going to skip through the Lacey Act implementation items as we've previously discussed those. Okay, so National Park Service, these items are largely related to kind of executive actions and overarching director's orders as opposed to more tangible program-specific areas. So one item that we targeted within these recommendations, in 2016, National Park Service completed an invasive plant program strategic plan that allows for a description of the overall goals, approaches, and strategies for managing invasive plants. So that is one item that we targeted for review. Another topic of interest was invasive species planning through executive actions. And then one more tangible item that we looked at, the Natural Resource Stewardship Program within the National Park Service. There is, let me go to the next slide. There is a lack of clarity on invasive species funding allocations within the stewardship program. So within natural resource managing programming at NPS more broadly, there is more of a lack of understanding as far as what is targeted where for invasive species management and prevention effort. Executive actions, so Director's Order 100, it looks at natural resource stewardship more broadly within the Park Service, but it was previously rescinded. We did request that that director's order be reinstated. Another one within strategic planning processes of NPS, there is what the units do, the individual units, and then there is the overarching umbrella goals of the National Park Service. Previously, there has been kind of a lack of coordination between the two entities to ensure that the on-the-ground unit-specific needs are being targeted, identified within these broader planning documents. Okay, so another one, funding, broken record. We're looking at for increased funding as well as an understanding of the funding targeted within the Natural Resource Stewardship Program. Also associated invasive species management team. So that is another tangible line item that we would like to see within NPS budgeting. On the collaboration side of things, so as I previously mentioned, looking to align the interests at individual units as well as NPS headquarters and ensuring there is an adequate information delivery and feedback system that headquarters can appropriately respond to. And then Director's Order 100, I previously mentioned that, looking at reinstatement of that director's order. And for next steps, so those were all of the agencies covered within the recommendations. As far as next steps go, we're looking at additional outreach and education opportunities on these recommendations. We have sent them to all congressional offices as well as administration contacts for the new administration. As many of these items interact with the annual appropriations process, we are looking at how to target these requests within the context of annual appropriations and associated testimony. Also, always looking at opportunities for additional partner engagement. If you have any thoughts or ideas on how these would be best presented in a future setting. We're also looking at how the new administration is shaping up. Items like the Invasive Species Advisory Committee that Scott mentioned, if that is to be reinvigorated, how to interact with them as well as government bodies like the National Invasive Species Council on these agency-specific recommendations. So if you have any questions, I would be happy to field them. I am not a topic matter expert, I will say, on all of the recommendations provided. This was very much a team effort. So if I am not able to answer any specific question asked, I will be happy to refer you to the correct point of contact. And thank you all so much for the opportunity to speak today.
Okay, thank you so much. That was fantastic. All right, that is our last presentation for today. So if I can ask our panelists to please turn your cameras back on. The Q&A is blowing up, so that's awesome. There's a lot of good questions there. And just to let everybody attending know, if we don't get to your question, I'll follow up with you after the event. The webinars are being recorded and posted on NAISMA's public YouTube channel after the event. So that is a common question. Wanted to share that. Okay. All right, so this first question is for Scott. Regarding the Invasive Species Caucus, how do they function and what can we do as invasive species professionals to engage and educate them to influence the budget items that we're all talked about here today? And of course, Carolyn and Belle, feel free to jump in as well.
Okay, thank you for the question. So the caucus has, for starters, it's in the House side. The Senate doesn't have caucuses. And on the House side, there's a Democratic co-chair, Mike Thompson from California, Republican co-chair, Elise Stefanik from New York, upstate New York. And the caucus functions very informally, very casually. At its peak in previous Congresses, they've had about 35 members. They have to start all over again at the beginning of every new Congress. So they're only a month or so into this Congress. They probably have about 8 or 9 members at this point. So what you can do is the House respects strength in numbers, right? So encourage your local congressman or congresswoman, as the case may be, to join the Congressional Invasive Species Caucus. If they're Democrats, they ought to contact Mike Thompson's office. If they're Republicans, they ought to contact Elise Stefanik's office.
Great, thank you, Scott. This is a question for anybody. What opportunities exist for the invasive species community, specifically funding projects and programs that fall under Biden's January 27th Climate Executive Order?
I'd have to look at it more closely. I don't have an opinion to offer right now. I think as we talk about invasive species, it's smart, given the focus of the White House on climate change, to relate invasive species to climate change to the extent we can, and be intellectually coherent about it.
Thank you.
I don't have any other items to add on top of that.
Nor do I. We're working on it. We're trying to figure out how to connect those dots.
Yeah, and that is a popular a topic that keeps coming up. So we are hoping to include more information on the climate crisis and the nexus with invasive species in our May NISAW series. So stay tuned. And if you have recommendations for speakers, send them to me. Okay, there are a number of questions about EDRR, or early detection and rapid response. And so I'm going to kind of give you two at once, if that's okay. The first is, what assistance does Congress or DOI have planned to provide assistance to the Fish and Wildlife Service, who is trying to establish the nationally coordinated EDRR program? And the second part to that is from a different attendee, but how do we connect with marine systems and marine invasives, as that appears to be somewhat not included in the current conversation? So kind of two parts. How do we support Fish and Wildlife Service in implementing the coordinated strategy, and how do we engage with the marine community? And that's for anyone.
I'll take a shot at that, and maybe Caroline will want to jump in. So the Fish and Wildlife Service has lots of statutory authorities, but each of which tends to be fairly narrow. So the challenge of putting money in the refuge system is getting refuge managers comfortable working outside of the refuge system. The program that has the most flexibility is the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program, where they can make essentially grants, cooperative agreements with anybody, anywhere. So part of the trick is figuring out where you're going to put the money. And that's both a function of what program gives you the most flexibility, but also, frankly, which program is likely to sustain those increases as it goes through the appropriations process. And in terms of the marine side, EDR is really hard in the marine environment. I don't know anyone who's figured out how to do it other than stop people from introducing their pet tropical fish into the Gulf of Mexico. But anyway.
Yeah, I guess I'll get a little bit into the marine component of things. So there is talking about the intersectionality of invasive species management and just like the breadth of organizations and stakeholders that are required to create these effective invasive species mechanisms. Yeah, I mean, that's a question that I don't know if I know the right answer to, but we're working on it. You know, we have this coalition setting. We are trying to figure out as many stakeholders as possible, and you know, marine entities being one of them. So that's something that was not addressed within our recommendations. I see a couple comments about aquatic invasive species, how that was not addressed. And that's very much a function of the entities that we've been capable of reaching out to date to create as, you know, as strong and as wide of recommendations as possible.
And just to piggyback on that, I think I would just add, NAISMA also wants to engage in that arena, and we're just now at the point where we're trying to figure out what capacity we need to make that happen. So coming soon, I hope.
And Caroline, thank you for bringing up the aquatic invasive species. We did have a couple of questions about, given that the Fish and Wildlife Service recommendations in your presentation were largely terrestrial based, and folks seeking support for state IIS plans and regional panels and the task force as a whole. So I appreciate you bringing that up, and just reiterate that we hear that question, and the NAISMA Legislative Committee is certainly looking at the AIS program and how we can support that as well. Okay. So this is specific for Scott. Has RISC made any strong efforts to recruit or hire personnel at your level that are from the party of the current administration? And is RISC, you know, what's the status of RISC, and where are they engaging at this point?
Okay. Well, RISC is still there. It's still active. I had to resign from RISC when I joined the administration in January 2017. And you know, based on the ethics rules, I had to keep fairly far away from RISC. So I'm not fully up to speed on exactly what it's been up to, but I hope to get back up to speed and see how I, as part of the community, can help that and other organizations, you know, advance the common cause.
Thank you. Okay, a topic near and dear to my heart, tagging back on to kind of the AIS question earlier. There has been a significant increase in invasive mussel funding across DOI, specifically for boat inspections and decontamination services. And I'll throw a side note in there that our Wednesday webinar, we're going to talk a lot about this, so join us Wednesday. But we are hurting here. We have a need for additional inspection stations than available funding can cover. And so how do we not only continue that mussel funding across the bureaus, but increase it in the future to contain the Colorado Basin infestations and protect the uninfested West? And I didn't prompt that question, I swear.
You sure you didn't write that one yourself, Elizabeth?
I didn't, but I get to talk about that Wednesday.
All right. So the trick here is getting as many members of Congress who are on the appropriations committees, House and Senate, as interested as possible. So that means, you know, identifying those members and figuring out who back in their home state or their home district cares about this issue, and making sure that they hear from those people. I made the point that all politics is local, and it's true that members really do care about what the people back home are saying. One thing I think that's important to communicate is members tend to focus on problems that are in front of their noses. Well, the problem that may be in front of your nose 6 months from now or 9 months from now is not necessarily as obvious. So alerting members from the Pacific Northwest or from California that they may be getting those mussels next if they don't invest in boat inspection and decontamination in the lower Colorado or the western edge of the Great Lakes, I think is an important idea to get across.
Yeah, I'll add to that. So speaking more broadly within the appropriations process, right now is a really great time to figure out and ask for a program that you care about. So many congressional offices at present are seeking input on what their appropriations priorities should be for this appropriation cycle. So it's, if you go to your member of Congress's website, it's very easy to figure out if they have an appropriations request form, fill it out, provide that context needed on the program that then they are able to reuse, regurgitate when they're making their requests. Especially if you are an individual constituent of a member of Congress, I would strongly recommend that. Members of Congress care first and foremost about what their constituents care about and hearing from their constituents. So that is going to be much more powerful than, you know, an organization in DC stating all of these concerns, making these asks. Obviously, that's an important component of it, but constituent level interaction is very key.
I'd amplify what Caroline said just for a second. I agree with her. To the extent you can get local organizations
Yes.
To weigh in, as opposed to, you know, one individual sending a letter. If you could get the county commissioners to send a letter, if you could get the State Water Users Association or the State Farm Bureau to send a letter, or the state chapter, the Sierra Club, Audubon, whatever, to send a letter, that has a lot more impact than just one individual's name.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. Yeah, my goal in stating that is to make these requests as local as possible and as relevant to the member as possible.
Thank you. That's great information. Okay, this is a question for all panelists. What do you think of the idea or the need for a federally centralized structure similar to CDC for invasive species? Decentralization has not worked, just as it has not worked for COVID. For example, I and several of my colleagues argue over the creation of Centers for Forest Pest Control and Prevention. So what do you think of the need for a centralized structure similar to CEC? I've also heard that question in the past in comparison to the Wildfire Coordinating Committee.
So I'll jump in maybe to start off. So the feds do some things really well. They do other things not particularly well at all. The best data, I think, inevitably is at the state and local level. I think trying to create, for instance, a national database would not be very productive because it would be outdated within hours. So what we really need to do, I think, at the federal level is create a technology platform for information to be shared, which also speaks to having data standards. So the information can be understandable and once it is shared. So the feds probably have a role in technology and in data standards and helping provide cash so the states can do some of this work. But also as a practical matter, it costs a lot less to hire a state government employee than it does a federal government employee, and even less to hire a local government employee than a state government employee. So your dollars are best leveraged, frankly, at the state and local level rather than hiring lots of feds. Having said that, as a former Fed myself, I think it's still true.
Yeah, I'll take a crack at that as well. So our recommendations really targeted a need for increased information sharing. And something we didn't really get into is the National Invasive Species Council and what it is going to look like into the future. There very much is an opportunity for reinvigoration. It's not a regulatory body, but it is an information sharing entity that is cross-agency and does allow for coordination on these invasive species challenges. Getting more specifically into federal government authorities. So some NISAS member organizations, including the Wildlife Society, we have previously looked at, would it be appropriate for Fish and Wildlife Service to have more direct authority over wildlife diseases and zoonotic diseases in coordination with entities like APHIS and CDC, and making them kind of an equal level partner, because at present their regulations are not really great and streamlined for actually interacting with an invasive pathogen or a disease that may be coming into the US and affecting native populations.
Scott, you recommended eDNA funding and prioritization. How do you see the federal government facilitating eDNA surveying and analysis for invasive species detections, which is typically a local or state effort?
Well, what I was thinking of was really basic research and how to make the technology more useful. And my understanding right now, and I don't have a PhD in this, so I'll confess, my understanding right now is we can detect the presence of DNA, but we can't necessarily predict how many of those organisms are in the water, or whether the DNA came from a dead organism or an organism that was swimming around, just a few hours earlier. So I think we need to spend more money on research to make the eDNA technology more useful in terms of giving us better analytical capacity and potentially some predictive ability. And I don't know if we're 2 years away from that or 5 years away from that, but I think we need to spend the money now to make as much progress as we can, as fast as we can.
There are a couple of different questions relating to capacity at all different levels. Capacity in some of the smaller nonprofits trying to help out with invasive species issues, all the way up to our local, state, and federal government. One of the questions relates to federal funding being given to the states, but yet the states don't have the capacity to hire folks. The bodies on the ground, money comes, but sometimes the bodies aren't there. And so how do we balance that need across the jurisdictions for increased capacity and getting more boots on the ground to do invasive species work? It's a tough question.
That's a really big question. Yeah. Scott, you got anything?
Well, I'm always the first one to jump in where, Angel.
Yeah, that is such an overarching question. Like, that's kind of like one of the challenges of our time. How do we ensure that investment in resources results in what we actually want to occur?
Why we have hard time hiring people at the state level is because there aren't enough biology majors out there. My thought would be that we try to leverage the nonprofit sector as much as possible. I know that in the Soil and Water Conservation District world, there's a lot of use of partnerships with local nonprofits, small local nonprofits. And so maybe the way to deal with the issue is to try to identify and empower those local nonprofits and give them seed money. With the explosion of technology and citizen science, I think it's easier maybe than it's been 5 or 10 years ago to leverage amateurs, informed amateurs. Maybe what we need is more outreach to local nonprofits and high schools and colleges to try to get young people interested in this issue.
I guess I'll simply second that. I have much to add.
Yeah, I think this is a great question, great points. I think what NAISMA could do is find a way to advocate for more funding to create jobs, and that invasive species work is a job creation opportunity.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's outstanding. And certainly in today's climate, job creation is a priority. So, okay, we are almost at the end of our webinar. So if we did not get to your question, I apologize, and I will do my best to follow back up with you. I want to thank our speakers. You just did an outstanding job. It's obvious that folks are hungry for this kind of information. And so I just really appreciate each and every one of you being here. I'm going to share my screen just for a moment. If everybody at home or in the office could just give a virtual round of applause to Belle, Scott, and Caroline. We are so grateful that you kicked us off with this amazing webinar this week. And just before we conclude, I want to share just a little bit about what we have going the rest of the week for you all. So tomorrow, we have free webinars all week, and tomorrow is our U.S. federal updates. And our list of speakers has grown in recent days. And so want to just make sure everybody knows the just fantastic lineup we have tomorrow from Interior and Agriculture and the Army Corps, including speakers from the Forest Service and the Ag Research Station and the Army's Research and Development Center. So we're super excited. So same time tomorrow, register at NISAW.org. Wednesday is our Aquatic Nuisance Species Priorities for Prevention and Management. So you'll hear from the ANS Task Force Executive Secretary Susan Pascoe, and you'll really get to dive in deep on zebra and quagga mussels and Asian carp on Wednesday. Thursday, we have our Science Policy and Solutions webinar. We'll talk about invasive species councils. We'll talk about the Tree Smart program. We have a great lineup for you on Wednesday. Wednesday. And then Friday, we'll really get into the details with Lee Van Wyken from the Weed Science Society of America on appropriations and how we move from getting the authority to do this work into getting this work funded on the ground. So again, these webinars will be recorded and put on NAISMA's public YouTube channel. You can register at NISAW.org. We invite you to ask your colleagues to attend. Invite your decision makers and your elected officials if there is a topic on one of our webinars that really connects to you and the work you're doing. We have our free resource toolkit, which is a turnkey set of materials for you. So please take them, download them, and use them. Like us on Facebook at Invasive Species Week and tag us and post this week. You can sign up for alerts and reminders on our website. We always welcome more sponsors and donations. And I invite every single person on this webinar, if you are not already a member of NAISMA, please visit NAISMA.org, take a look at our membership and partnership options, join our organization, be a part of the dialogue, and participate on our legislative committee if you are able. So again, NAISMA mission is to support, promote, and empower invasive species prevention and management in North America. I am so glad that you were all able to join us today. I can't even tell you just how excited I am from the discussion over these last 90 minutes. So thank you to our speakers. Thank you to all the attendees and for all the questions that you put in. We so appreciate it. We hope we see you tomorrow and on social media, and just keep an eye out for our May series the week of May 17th. And then hopefully we'll be back in DC next year. So with that, I conclude our first NISAW webinar of this week's series. And again, thank you all. We appreciate you. Have a great rest of your day.